we as humans have made advancements with regards to things like inertial mass reduction, with regards to things like the emission of high-frequency gravitational waves. And if I could say very quickly for the audience, inertial mass reduction means you're basically reducing the mass of an object. So it begins to essentially fall up instead of the way that you would drop an object. It begins to essentially fall upwards because you're biasing the potentials of the mass of that object itself.
So you're getting into Sal Pais. Sal Pais, for the audience, is a Navy engineer who holds patents, 3 extremely interesting patents involving inertial mass reduction and, exotic flight principles and that sort of thing.
Yes, yes.
And I just interviewed him, actually. And so.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. He's a great guy. He's a really good guy.
Awesome guy. I like him a lot. Yeah. Sensitive soul.
Oh, he's a very, very sweet guy. Yeah. Very sweet guy. I think that to your question, that we as humans have made advancements with regards to things like inertial mass reduction, with regards to things like the emission of high-frequency gravitational waves. And if I could say very quickly for the audience, inertial mass reduction means you're basically reducing the mass of an object. So it begins to essentially fall up instead of the way that you would drop an object. It begins to essentially fall upwards because you're biasing the potentials of the mass of that object itself.
And this is something that's been reported by Eugene Plekletnov, and it's also, and that goes back to Victor Schauberger, because his dad was actually a Soviet agent that retrieved Victor Schauberger's files.
Yes.
But that also connects with this modern anti-gravity conspiracy. You have this woman named Ning Li, who's at University of Alabama, Huntsville.
Yep.
And she claims to have a mass reduction effect over a spinning superconductor. And so do you basically believe both of those accounts?
I think there may be something there with Podkletnov. Forgive me, I have to be careful with regards to what I say about Ning Li, but what I can say about that is that there is evidence, of which I'd be happy to provide to you afterwards, where in the early 2000s, she had sent an email to, I forgot who it was exactly, someone in the alternative propulsion community, where she claimed she had generated about 11 kilowatts of high-frequency gravitational waves.
Whoa.
The email messaging was then intercepted by an IP address from West Point, and then from there, you never heard from her again.
From there, she wins this, top secret military contract. She gets a clearance.
Correct.
And she kind of falls off the face of the earth. She leaves the University of Alabama, Huntsville.
Yep.
You could just say, oh, her work fell off, she was a quack or whatever. But then we found out since that Larry Smalley, who was the head of the physics department at University of Alabama, Huntsville, goes and joins her. And Larry Smalley, his name is on a patent in 2004 that basically involves an asymmetric barrel-shaped capacitor, and it's for NASA.
Right.
And it connects all the way back to Townsend Brown's work. And that was like the original kind of anti-gravity guy who was using capacitors to maybe manipulate space-time.
Exactly. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ning Li was actually more focused on superconductors in a solid-state sense. I know initially in the 90s, she was collecting data on ring superconductors, but I believe the issue with spinning it after a certain threshold was that the disks, the rings would begin to break. So I know she was looking into a more solid state aspect. However, there is a paper that was released by Bob Baker under the MITRE Corporation for one of the high-frequency gravitational wave conferences, where you cannot actually access the entire paper, just the abstract introduction, where I'm paraphrasing, but Bob Baker talks about, he's now since deceased, but he talked about how Ning Li was able to generate up to 11 kilowatts of gravitational waves, and essentially there were 2 types of gravity that she had discovered, which was AC gravity and DC gravity. So a static type of gravity and then an alternating current type of gravity, under the notion that gravity comes from the topological displacement of matter topologies, meaning essentially you can use electromagnetism in a certain format in which would then, at the next level above, through the curving of space-time, allow you to control gravity electromagnetically.
Whoa, wait, explain that. And it's interesting you say the 2 types of gravity, because that comes up a lot.
Well, you can also correlate that to, and this is for your viewers and yourself to decide for yourself, to Mr. Lazar's gravity A wave and B wave.
That's what I was going to bring up.
AC gravity, DC gravity. It's possible.
Well, my take on Lazar is he was kind of as Bob Lazar is, I mean, the audience is definitely going to know who he is, but like, he claimed to have worked at S4 Area 51, reverse engineering UFOs.
Right.
And he also came out saying some interesting things about the flight principles that these, crafts used.
Right.
And he talks about two forms of gravity, gravity A and gravity B.
Right.
And I kind of have come to the conclusion after researching Lazar for a while that he was a limited hangout of a person.
Right.
So I think this guy, John Lear, who was CIA affiliated, pushed him out to Georgia Knapp. And that for whatever reason, the powers that be wanted Lazar out.
Right.
But they wanted him out because I don't think he had a super sophisticated theoretical physics understanding. I think he had more of a engineering topological physics.
I agree.
And so you have these, it's almost like gravity A, gravity B. That's not saying too much.
Right.
But if you're smart enough, maybe you can get initiated or something. Figure that out.
Right. And that's why I say again, I myself am still 50-50 as to where I stand with the entire story of Mr. Lazar. But I do think that there are interesting correlations between what he claimed was the A and B wave and then Ning Li's AC and DC gravity waves.
So what are these two forms of gravity? How do they work?
So basically you have a DC gravity that allegedly, at least according to the very general abstract of her report, and forgive me because I can't really expand past this point. However, the idea is that there's a static type of gravitational wave that does not depend on the square root of the electric permittivity, but rather depends on the strength of the source of the magnetostatic field in which it's coming from. And then there's AC gravity, which is far stronger and is not static in any capacity. It is something that you would utilize in a pulsed-based scenario, in which would actually, if you were to view its geometry, would emit the same way that in the same geometry that that a caduceus or double helix would.
Interesting. And what, gravitons?
Gravitons, correct.
So gravity particles.
Right. Now, I say that because I think the term gravitons is still controversial in mainstream science. However, there are papers that were funded by the MITRE Corporation going back 20, 25 years that show that gravitons were both very high frequency and extremely low frequency gravitons were detectable near the Earth's atmosphere. Now, why that hasn't been more publicly stated, I don't know.
Interesting.
I'd be happy to provide you the documents
Please.
privately. I also know that the Soviets, before the Soviet Union fell, were looking into essentially the notion that Einstein's general relativity was a very rudimentary static understanding of space-time itself. I know Einstein himself flip-flopped on the notion of the quantum vacuum or the ether.
Yeah.
I think he was for it, then he was against it, then for it, then against it. And I'm not sure, there's rumors that he worked with Nikola Tesla before he passed. As to whether that could be substantiated or not, I don't know. I wasn't around at the time.
Well, he definitely, I think early on with special relativity, he was like, relativity is not compatible with the ether. And then I think in 1921-ish time frame, he then says, actually, general relativity is compatible with the ether, but it was sort of silent and people forgot about it.
Correct.
And then you have quantum electrodynamics and Feynman later, and the vacuum of space is filled with energy. And so he's kind of like reinstantiating the ether, sort of.
I think so. Yeah.
But I want to get back to gravitons because there's a really interesting article from 1956 called "The G Engines Are Coming" or something like that. It's by this guy Michael Gladich, and it's all about how we have all these vital anti-gravity programs. Those anti-gravity programs are kind of analogous to our atomic programs, and we're going to beat gravity, and it's right around the bend. And in it is quoted, I believe, two scientists at Princeton, Stanley Desser and Richard Arnowit.
Okay.
And it says these guys are working with, we figured out G particles, gravity particles.
Right.
And I find that to be such an interesting part of the article that nobody really talks about is these guys are talking about gravity particles.
Right, exactly. All these publications and whether it was in the literature or newspapers going back to the 1950s all the way to the 70s, I've always said, as I've said to you privately, once the late 1970s hit, there are some papers still that came out in the 80s dealing with spinning gyroscopes with certain electrical and other components applied to them, where the spinning gyroscope would lose some of its mass. And then when the gyroscope was turned towards the Earth's axis or against the Earth's axis, depending which way you pointed it, it would gain some of the mass back. So in other words, it was conducted in magnetically shielded laboratories. It was shown, for example, that certain effects would occur that were not artifacts experimentally, that could not be ruled out.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how does doing all of this stuff, how does doing these experiments allow for mass reduction?
The idea is that you can exchange. Now, this is where it becomes very esoteric, but the idea is that you can exchange the internal mass of an object with the local environment or the local space-time itself. So the notion that energy cannot be created or destroyed would be correct. You're just basically cycling that energy in and out from the object because of spin coupled to an electromagnetic induction field combined with something else that I'll tell you off the air that would allegedly prove this to, or show at least proof of concept that there would be mass reduction.
And this is the work of Salvatore Pais, where he's saying that, like, if you couple spin with these specific electromagnetic charges, you can break the Schwinger limit. You get this runaway.
Right now, the idea is with regard the Schwinger limit is essentially, very simply put, the notion that after a certain threshold of electromagnetically, the vacuum becomes nonlinear.
Yes,
so to speak. I think it was, I forgot what it was, 10 to the power of 8. I don't want to say.
And Hal Puthoff talks about electrically polarizable vacuums as well. Yes, so it's like,
I'm a big proponent of that.
And then you have this speech from Jim Ryder, who's a Lockheed Martin Space Systems guy, who we now know tried to transfer a quote unquote UFO to Bigelow Aerospace in 2008, according to Lou Elizondo, a bunch of other people. And he talks about an electrically polarizable vacuum as well. And maybe an interesting analogy for the audience, if you're like me and an idiot when it comes to this stuff. Like if you had like a plastic bag with water in it, and you were to like press down on one side, that would be sort of electrically polarizing the vacuum, and maybe you could surf space-time as a result.
The same way a surfer surfs on water, or water waves. Correct. If we
say there's a little surfer figurine on the bag or whatever, it surfs down the
exactly. And now that would be using vacuum polarization, as Dr. Puthoff, I believe, has a fantastic paper on space-time metric engineering. That shows that. Now, if I could clarify, as I understand it, that is a little bit different than actually having a device that would emit through pulse-based systems high-frequency gravitational waves. However, the physics are indeed interconnected, very much so.
And how do you get to a thing that emits high frequency gravitational waves?
Well, there's speculation that very intense lasers could do it in what's considered like a Hull-Rum array. There's speculation that you can use, this is very controversial, but you can use superconductors to do it. There are speculation, for example, that you could use certain geometrical setup of superconductors that could induce these effects. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So what useful stuff can you do? Because we're speaking really abstractly now.
Sure.
What can you do that changes the world with any of these things?
You can essentially, forgive me, because this is where I'm going to have to be careful, but you can essentially do things, for example, from an energy perspective where maybe, and I say this speculatively, it's possible that you can output more energy in a device than you're inputting.
Okay.
Which would imply coefficient of performance over 1, which would violate the second law of thermodynamics, and there would need to be a readjustment to the law of conservation of energy, because you're dealing with a larger open system. So if you implement the vacuum and the vector and scalar potentials into your equations, it would actually be feasible. Second law of thermodynamics, it would be completely violated because, again, it's possible in these cases we would be dealing in some cases with electrical currents that are cold instead of hot, which is very controversial to say.